October 1943, a Mosquito screams across German airspace at 380 miles per hour. Fast, but not fast enough. Behind it, a Messerschmitt Bf-109 closes the gap, its pilot's finger hovering over the cannon trigger. The wooden wonder that was supposed to be untouchable is about to become another kill marking on a Luftwaffe fuselage, unless someone, somewhere, finds a way to get faster. Flight Lieutenant David Perry felt the Mosquito shudder as he pushed the throttles forward to their stops. The twin Merlin engines howled at maximum continuous power, their superchargers forcing air into cylinders already burning at the edge of their design limit. Through the Perspex canopy, the night sky over Berlin glowed orange from fires below, but Perry's attention was locked on the rearview mirror mounted above his instrument panel. The Messerschmitt was still there, a dark silhouette against the searchlight beams, and it was getting closer. The reconnaissance mission had gone perfectly until 3 minutes ago. Perry had photographed the Tempelhof rail yards from 28,000 feet, the Mosquito's cameras capturing every detail of the marshalling areas and repair facilities. The return route took him northwest toward the coast, descending gradually to pick up speed in thicker air. That's when the 109 found him. At 22,000 feet, the German fighter had every advantage. The Bf-109 G6 was in its element here, the Daimler-Benz engine delivering maximum power while Perry's Merlins were still gasping in the thin air. The Mosquito was faster at altitude, but down here, in this deadly middle zone between the stratosphere and the deck, the margin was razor thin. Perry watched the 109 creep closer. 500 yards, 400. Soon it would be in cannon range. The Mosquito had no defensive armament, no rear gunner to drive off the attacker. Speed was its only defense, and right now, speed wasn't enough. He considered his options: dive for the deck and hope to outrun the 109 in a straight race, risk everything on a violent evasive maneuver that might shake the German but would bleed precious speed, or push into the cloud layer 3,000 feet below and pray he didn't fly into a mountain. The decision was made for him when tracer rounds arced past the starboard wing. The 109 had opened fire at extreme range, testing the distance. Perry shoved the control column forward and rolled left, diving into the clouds. The Mosquito plunged into gray nothingness, instruments spinning as he fought to keep the aircraft under control. When he broke through the bottom of the cloud deck at 18,000 feet, the 109 was gone. Perry leveled off and turned for home, his hands shaking slightly on the controls. He'd escaped, but barely. The Messerschmitt had been seconds away from a killing position. As the adrenaline faded, a cold realization settled over him. The Mosquito's speed advantage was disappearing. The Germans were catching up. Back at RAF Benson 3 hours later, Perry climbed out of the cockpit and found Flight Sergeant James Kynock by the wing. The engine fitter had a habit of meeting returning aircraft, checking for oil leaks or battle damage before the pilots had even removed their helmets. Perry told him about the 109, about how close it had come. Kynock listened, his weathered face impassive, then walked around the Mosquito, running his hands along the engine cowlings. The Merlins were still ticking as they cooled, metal contracting with soft pinging sounds. "Engines gave you everything they had?" Kynock asked. "Everything and then some," Perry replied. "Wasn't quite enough." Kynock nodded slowly, his mind already working on a problem that would consume him for the next 2 months. The strategic situation in late 1943 demanded more from the Mosquito than ever before. The Allied bombing campaign against Germany was reaching its peak intensity, with 1,000 bomber raids striking industrial targets across the Reich. But bombs alone couldn't win the war. Intelligence was needed. Detailed, up-to-date photographs of factories, rail yards, airfields, and coastal defenses. That was the Mosquito's job. The de Havilland Mosquito had entered service in 1941 as a radical experiment, a bomber with no defensive guns, relying entirely on speed and altitude to survive. The concept worked brilliantly. Built largely of wood to conserve strategic materials, powered by 2 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, the Mosquito could outrun almost anything the Luftwaffe put in the air. Photo reconnaissance variants ranged deep into German territory, their cameras capturing intelligence that shaped Allied strategy. But by autumn 1943, the Luftwaffe was fighting back with improved equipment. The Messerschmitt Bf-109G had evolved through multiple variants, each more capable than the last. The G6 model, now entering widespread service, featured the DB605AM engine with methanol water injection for emergency power. When the MW50 system was activated, the 109 could briefly match or exceed the Mosquito's speed, especially at medium altitudes where interceptions most often occurred. The numbers told a worrying story. In September 1943, Bomber Command's reconnaissance units lost 4 Mosquitoes over Germany. In October, 6 more failed to return. November saw another 5 lost, not catastrophic numbers, but a clear upward trend. Debriefing reports from surviving crews mentioned increasingly aggressive interceptions, with German fighters pressing attacks at altitudes where they'd previously broken off. The tactical response was predictable. Reconnaissance missions were shifted to higher altitudes where the Mosquito's performance advantage was more pronounced. Routes were varied to avoid predictable patterns. More missions were flown at night, though this reduced photographic quality. But these were defensive measures, reactions to German improvements rather than solutions to the fundamental problem. The problem was simple. The Mosquito needed to be faster. At RAF Benson, home to several photo reconnaissance squadrons, the engineering staff understood the situation better than most. Squadron leader Peter Simmons, the senior engineering officer, had access to intelligence reports on German fighter development. He knew about the DB-605AM engine, about MW-50 injection, about the performance gains the Luftwaffe was achieving. He also knew that Rolls-Royce wasn't going to deliver a more powerful Merlin variant anytime soon. The production lines were running flat out building existing models. Major engine upgrades would take months or years to develop and deploy. If the Mosquito was going to get faster, it would have to happen in the field. Flight Sergeant James Kynoch had been working on Merlin engines since before the war. He'd started as an apprentice at the Rolls-Royce factory in Derby, learning the intricacies of supercharger design and fuel mixture control. When war came, he'd enlisted in the RAF, and his expertise had quickly earned him a posting to a frontline squadron. By 1943, there wasn't much about the Merlin that Kynoch didn't understand. He understood, for instance, that the engine's rated power limits were conservative. Rolls-Royce designed the Merlin to run reliably for hundreds of hours between overhauls, which meant building in safety margin. The maximum boost pressure of 18 pounds per square inch wasn't the point where the engine would explode. It was the point where Rolls-Royce engineers felt confident the engine would last its expected service life. But what if you didn't need it to last that long? What if you only needed maximum power for a few minutes, just enough to outrun a pursuing fighter? Kynoch had been thinking about boost pressure for months. The Merlin supercharger compressed incoming air before it entered the cylinders, allowing the engine to maintain power at high altitude. The amount of compression was measured as boost pressure, controlled by a throttle gate that prevented pilots from exceeding safe limits. But Kynoch had noticed something during routine maintenance. The engines were running cooler than expected. Cylinder head temperatures, exhaust gas temperatures, oil temperature, all were comfortably below maximum ratings, even during hard climbs to altitude. That suggested thermal headroom. If the engine wasn't getting too hot at 18 pounds of boost, maybe it could handle more. The other piece of the puzzle was fuel. In late 1943, small quantities of 150-octane aviation gasoline began arriving at RAF bases, reserved for priority operations. Standard fuel was 100 octane, which was adequate for normal operations, but limited how much boost pressure could be used before detonation occurred. Detonation, uncontrolled explosion of the fuel-air mixture, could destroy an engine in seconds. Higher octane fuel resisted detonation, allowing higher compression ratios and boost pressures. Kynoch did the math. If he could adjust the boost control gate to allow higher manifold pressure, and if the aircraft was fueled with 150 octane, the Merlin should be able to produce significantly more power without detonating. The increased thermal and mechanical stress would shorten engine life, but for short bursts, 5 minutes, maybe 10, it should be manageable. The question was whether anyone would let him try. In December 1943, Kynoch approached Squadron Leader Simmons with his idea. The conversation was carefully phrased. Kynoch didn't ask for permission to modify an operational aircraft. That would have forced Simmons to either officially approve or officially deny the request. Instead, he presented it as a theoretical discussion about engine performance margin. Simmons understood what Kynoch was really asking. He also understood the potential consequences. If the modification worked, it could save lives and improve mission success rates. If it failed catastrophically, if an engine exploded in flight, killing a crew, Simmons would be responsible for authorizing an unsafe modification. But Simmons also remembered the intelligence report, the loss statistics, the debriefing accounts of Mosquitos barely escaping German fighters. He made a decision that was typical of RAF engineering culture in 1943. He told Kynoch he couldn't officially approve any unauthorized modifications, but he also wouldn't be inspecting the boost control gates on any particular aircraft in the near future. It was enough. Kynoch chose a Mosquito PR.5 that was due for a routine engine inspection. The aircraft, serial number MM397, belonged to Flight Lieutenant Perry, the same pilot who'd nearly been caught over Berlin. Working after hours in the maintenance hangar, Kynoch removed the boost control unit from the starboard Merlin 72 engine. The unit was a mechanical governor that limited how far the throttle could be advanced, preventing manifold pressure from exceeding 18 pounds per square inch. The modification was elegantly simple. Kynoch adjusted the gate mechanism to allow the throttle to advance further, increasing maximum boost to 21 pounds per square inch. He didn't go higher. This was an experiment, not a suicide attempt. 3 pounds of additional boost should produce roughly 10 to 15% more power, which translated to a meaningful speed increase. He made the same modification to the port engine, then reinstalled both units. The entire process took about 4 hours. When he was finished, there was no external evidence of the change. The engines looked identical to every other Merlin on the flight line. The next morning, Kinnock ran both engines on the ground test stand. He advanced the throttles slowly, watching the boost pressure gauges climb past their normal maximum. At 21 pounds, he held the setting for 2 minutes, monitoring temperatures and listening for any sign of detonation. The engines ran smoothly, their exhaust note deepening as the superchargers forced more air into cylinder head. Temperatures rose, but stayed within acceptable limits. No detonation knock, no unusual vibration. Kinnock shut down the engines and found Perry in the crew room. He explained what he'd done, emphasizing the risks. The modification was untested in flight. It might cause engine failure. It definitely voided any warranty Rolls-Royce might have offered, and it was completely unauthorized. Perry listened, then asked the only question that mattered. "Will it make us faster?" "Should do," Kinnock replied. "Maybe 12, 15 miles per hour. Enough to matter. Then let's find out." The test flight was logged as a routine engine performance check, which was technically accurate. Perry took off alone, climbing to 25,000 feet over the English countryside. At altitude, he leveled off and pushed the throttles forward to their normal maximum. The Mosquito accelerated to its usual cruise speed, about 360 miles per hour indicated. Then, Perry pushed the throttles past their normal stops. The boost pressure gauges climbed past 18 pounds, past 19, settling at 21. The Merlin engines responded instantly, their note rising to a sharper howl. The airspeed indicator needle swung right, climbing through 370, 375, 380 miles per hour. Perry held the setting for 5 minutes, monitoring every gauge on the instrument panel. Oil pressure steady, oil temperature rising but acceptable. Cylinder head temperatures higher than normal, but not critical. The engines felt smooth, no vibration or roughness that might indicate detonation. He throttled back to normal boost and turned for home. During the landing approach, both engines ran normally, no signs of damage or distress. After shutdown, Kinnock was waiting with a thermometer and inspection tools, checking for any evidence of thermal stress or mechanical failure. The engines were fine, and the Mosquito had been measurably faster. Over the next 2 weeks, Perry flew 3 more test flights, each time pushing the boost override a little harder. He experimented with different altitudes, finding that the modification worked best between 20 and 28,000 feet, exactly the altitude band where German fighters were most dangerous. He tested the engine's cooling capacity, determining that 5 to 10 minutes of continuous override was safe, with longer periods possible if he cycled the boost on and off. By early January 1944, Perry and Kinnock were confident enough to use the modification operationally. The opportunity came on January 12th, when Perry was assigned a reconnaissance mission over the Kiel Naval Yard. Intelligence wanted updated photographs of U-boat construction facilities, and Kiel was heavily defended by both flak and fighters. Perry briefed his navigator on the boost override, explaining when and how he'd use it. The mission profile called for a high-altitude approach, descending to 23,000 feet for the photography run, then climbing back to altitude for the return flight. If they were intercepted during the vulnerable descent or climb phases, Perry would engage the override. The mission went exactly as planned until the photography run was complete. As Perry turned northwest and began climbing, ground controllers at Jever Airfield scrambled a pair of Bf-109 G6s. The German fighters climbed rapidly, vectored by radar toward the Mosquito's position. At 24,000 feet, Perry spotted them, 2 dark shapes climbing from the east, still 3,000 feet but closing fast. This was the test. Perry advanced the throttles past their normal stops, engaging the boost override. The Merlins surged, and the Mosquito leaped forward. The rate of climb increased noticeably, the altimeter winding up through 25,000, 26,000 feet. The 109s continued their pursuit, but the gap wasn't closing anymore. It was widening. At 28,000 feet, Perry leveled off and looked back. The Messerschmitts were still climbing, but they were falling behind, unable to match the Mosquito's combination of speed and climb rate. After 2 more minutes, the German fighters gave up and turned back toward the coast. Perry throttled back to normal boost and continued home. When he landed at Benson, Kinnock was waiting with his inspection tools. They examined both engines carefully, looking for any signs of damage. There were none. The modification had worked perfectly under operational conditions. Word spread quickly through the squadron. Other pilots heard about Perry's successful escape and wanted the same modification for their aircraft. Other fitters, intrigued by Kinnock's work, asked for details on how to perform the adjustment. Within 2 weeks, half a dozen Mosquitos at Benson had been modified with boost override capability. Squadron leader Simmons watched this development with mixed feelings. On one hand, the modification was clearly effective and relatively safe. On the other hand, it was spreading without any official approval or standardized procedures. If something went wrong, if an engine failed and an investigation traced it back to unauthorized modifications, there would be serious consequences. Simmons made another calculated decision. He called Kynoch and several other senior fitters to his office and told them that if they were going to continue making these modifications, they needed to do it properly. He wanted documentation, exactly what was being changed, what the limitations were, how pilots should use the override. He wanted standardized procedures, so every fitter was making the same adjustments. And he wanted maintenance protocols to catch any problems before they became catastrophic. What Simmons didn't do was report the modifications up the chain of command. That would have forced Air Ministry officials to make a decision, and bureaucratic decisions took time. Better to let the innovation continue at the squadron level, where it could be refined and proven before higher authorities got involved. By February 1944, the boost override had become standard practice in several reconnaissance squadrons. Fitters had refined the modification, settling on 21 pounds per square inch as the optimal boost pressure, high enough for significant performance gains, low enough to avoid excessive engine stress. They'd developed inspection procedures to check for early signs of wear, focusing on piston rings, cylinder heads, and supercharger bearings. Pilots received informal briefings on how to use the override. The guidance was simple. Use it only when necessary, for no more than 5 to 10 minutes at a time, and monitor engine temperatures closely. If oil temperature or cylinder head temperature approached maximum limits, throttle back immediately. The override was an emergency measure, not a standard operating procedure. The operational impact was immediate and measurable. Mission success rates improved as Mosquitos were able to evade interceptions more effectively. Loss rates declined, not dramatically, but enough to be statistically significant. In January 1944, reconnaissance units lost 3 Mosquitos over Germany. In February, only 1. March saw 2 losses, but neither involved aircraft with boost override capability. The intelligence value was harder to quantify but equally important. Mosquitos with boost override could penetrate deeper into German airspace with greater confidence, photographing targets that had previously been too risky to approach. The pre-invasion reconnaissance of French coastal defenses, critical for D-Day plan, was conducted largely by Mosquitos equipped with the modification. German fighter pilots noticed the change. Luftwaffe combat reports from early 1944 began mentioning Mosquitos that were unexpectedly fast, or faster than usual. Some German pilots suspected the British had introduced a new Mosquito variant with more powerful engines. In reality, it was the same aircraft, just pushed beyond its official limits. But the boost override came with costs that became apparent as the months passed. Engine life was significantly reduced. A Merlin that normally ran for 300 hours between major overhauls might need service after 200 hours if regularly operated with boost override. Component wear was accelerated, particularly on pistons and cylinder heads that endured higher temperatures and pressures. The maintenance burden fell on the ground crew. Fitters like Kynoch found themselves working longer hours, conducting more frequent inspections, replacing parts more often. The RAF's logistics system, already strained by the demands of a global war, had to adjust to higher consumption rates of spare engines and components. Squadron commanders had to make difficult calculations. Was the operational advantage worth the maintenance cost? Was it acceptable to wear out engines faster if it meant completing more missions and losing fewer aircraft? The answer, consistently, was yes. Engines could be replaced. Trained aircrew could not. By spring 1944, the boost override had come to the attention of higher RAF authorities. Reports from squadron engineering officers mentioned the modification in passing, usually in the context of explaining increased engine maintenance requirements. Air Ministry staff officers, reading these reports, began asking questions. In April, a team of Rolls-Royce engineers visited RAF Benson to investigate. They examined modified engines, reviewed maintenance logs, and interviewed pilots and fitters. Their assessment was cautiously positive. The modification was technically sound, though it operated outside the engine's design parameters. The increased wear was significant but manageable. The performance gains were real and operationally valuable. Rolls-Royce's official position was carefully worded. They couldn't endorse modifications that voided the engine's warranty and reduced its service life. But they acknowledged that under operational necessity, the boost override represented an acceptable trade-off between performance and reliability. In other words, we won't recommend it, but we won't stop you. The Air Ministry's response was similarly pragmatic. No official policy was issued authorizing the boost override, but no orders were given prohibiting it either. Squadron commanders were left to make their own decisions based on operational requirements. In practice, this meant the modification continued to spread, eventually reaching night fighter squadrons and other Mosquito units beyond the original reconnaissance squadron. Kynoch received no official recognition for his innovation. There was no medal, no commendation in his service record, no mention in official histories, but his squadron commander quietly noted his contribution in a fitness report, and when the war ended, Rolls-Royce offered him a position as a development engineer. He accepted, spending the next 20 years working on jet engine design, applying lessons learned from his wartime improvisation. Flight Lieutenant Perry completed his operational tour in June 1944, having flown 43 reconnaissance missions over occupied Europe. He survived the war and remained in the RAF, eventually retiring as a wing commander in 1962. In post-war interviews, he credited the boost override with saving his life on at least 3 occasions when German fighters came too close for comfort. The broader significance of the boost override extended beyond its immediate tactical. It demonstrated the value of frontline innovation, of allowing experienced personnel to experiment and adapt within broad guidelines rather than rigid rules. The RAF's engineering culture encouraged this kind of initiative, trusting skilled fitters and pilots to make sound technical decisions under operational pressure. This approach contrasted with the Luftwaffe's more centralized system, where modifications typically required approval from higher authorities. German pilots and ground crews were certainly capable of innovation, but the bureaucratic structure made it harder for field-level improvements to spread quickly. The boost override succeeded partly because it could be implemented and refined at the squadron level without waiting for official approval. The modification also highlighted different engineering philosophies. British engine designers tended toward conservative ratings with built-in safety margins, accepting slightly lower performance in exchange for reliability and longevity. German designers often pushed closer to theoretical limits, accepting higher maintenance requirements for maximum performance. The boost override represented a middle ground, using British engineering conservatism as a reserve that could be tapped when necessary. Post-war analysis of Merlin engine development showed that the boost override influenced official specifications. Later, Mosquito variants, including the PR-34 and NF, E-36 models, had higher official boost ratings that incorporated lessons learned from field modifications. Rolls-Royce engineers recognized that operational experience had revealed greater capability than their conservative initial ratings suggested. The transition to jet engines in the late 1940s brought new challenges, but the lessons of the boost override remained relevant. Early jet engines also had conservative thrust ratings with thermal margins that could be exploited in emergencies. The concept of war emergency power became formalized in jet fighter design, with official procedures for temporary thrust increases beyond normal limits. The human stories behind the boost override are preserved in archives and veteran accounts. Kynoch's handwritten notes on boost control adjustment procedures survive in the RAF Museum's collection, along with maintenance logs showing the increased inspection frequency for modified engines. Perry's logbook, donated to the Imperial War Museum, includes cryptic notations like boost override used on several mission entries. Other fitters who worked on the modification left their own records. Flight Sergeant William Morrison, who served with No. 544 Squadron, kept a detailed diary describing the process of adjusting boost controls and the results of test flight. His entries capture the mixture of excitement and anxiety that accompanied the innovation. Excitement at solving a critical operational problem, anxiety about potential consequences if something went wrong. Pilot accounts emphasize the psychological impact of having an emergency speed reserve. Knowing that the boost override was available, even if rarely used, provided confidence during deep penetration missions over heavily defended targets. Several pilots described it as similar to a parachute. You hoped never to need it, you were glad it was there. The statistical evidence, while incomplete, supports the conclusion that the boost override made a meaningful difference. Comparing loss rates and mission success rates before and after the modification's introduction shows clear improvements, though other factors, improved tactics, declining Luftwaffe effectiveness, better intelligence, also contributed. What's certain is that squadron commanders believed the modification was valuable enough to accept the maintenance costs and potential risks. The story of the boost override also illustrates the often overlooked contribution of ground crews to air warfare. Pilots received medals and public recognition, but the fitters, riggers, and armorers who kept aircraft flying rarely got similar attention. Yet their expertise and dedication were essential to operational success. Kynoch and his fellow fitters understood the Merlin engine as well as the Rolls-Royce engineers who designed it, and in some ways better, because they saw how it performed under combat conditions. The modifications spread across multiple squadrons demonstrated the informal networks that existed within the RAF. Fitters transferred between units, carrying knowledge and techniques with them. Pilots who'd experienced the boost override's benefits requested it when they moved to new squadrons. Engineering officers shared information through official and unofficial channels. This organic diffusion of innovation was faster and more flexible than any formal technology transfer program. By the summer of 1944, as Allied forces advanced across France following the D-Day landings, the strategic situation that had prompted the boost override began to change. The Luftwaffe was in decline, its fighter forces worn down by attrition and fuel shortage. Interceptions of reconnaissance. Mosquitos became less frequent and less aggressive. The desperate need for every possible speed advantage diminished, but the modification remained in use through the end of the war. Night fighter Mosquitos hunting German bombers over Britain used boost override to catch fleeing targets. Mosquitos operating in the Far East against Japanese fighters found the extra speed valuable in a different theater. The innovation that began as a response to a specific threat proved adaptable to various operational contexts. The engineering cost remained significant. By war's end, Mosquito squadrons were consuming engines at rates 30% higher than originally projected. Maintenance man-hours per flight hour increased proportionally, but the RAF's logistics system adapted, increasing spare engine production and streamlining overhaul procedures. The cost was accepted as the price of maintaining operational effectiveness. Modern aviation historians recognize the boost override as an example of successful field modification, comparable to other wartime innovations like the addition of drop tanks to fighters or the development of skip bombing techniques. These weren't laboratory inventions or factory improvements. They were solutions developed by operational personnel facing immediate problems. The best military organizations create environments where such innovation can flourish. The technical details of the modification have been preserved through various sources. Post-war technical reports documented the boost control adjustments and their effects on engine performance. Rolls-Royce's internal records include analyses of engines that had been operated with boost override, examining wear patterns and failure mode. These documents provide insight into both the modification's effectiveness and its limitations. One particularly detailed report, compiled by RAF Engineering Branch in 1945, analyzed 50 Merlin engines that had been operated with boost override for extended periods. The findings confirmed what Kynoch and other fitters had observed. Cylinder head wear was accelerated by approximately 25%, piston ring wear by 30%, and supercharger bearing wear by 20%. However, catastrophic failures were rare, occurring at rates only slightly higher than engines operated within normal limits. The report concluded that the boost override represented an acceptable operational expedient under combat conditions, carefully worded language that acknowledged both the modification's value and its departure from standard engineering practice. It recommended that if similar situations arose in future conflicts, formal procedures should be developed rather than relying on informal field modification. That recommendation reflected a tension inherent in military aviation, the need for standardization and safety versus the need for flexibility and innovation. Standardization ensures reliability and simplifies logistics, but it can also stifle adaptation to changing circumstances. The boost override succeeded because the RAF's culture allowed enough flexibility for innovation while maintaining enough discipline to prevent reckless experimentation. The German parallel is instructive. The Luftwaffe had its own emergency power system, particularly the MW-50 methanol water injection used in late war fighters. This was a factory-installed system with official procedures and limitations, more sophisticated than the RAF's field modification, but also more rigid. German pilots couldn't adjust or experiment with the system. They could only use it as designed. The British approach was cruder, but more adaptable. As the war ended and military aviation transitioned to the jet age, the lessons of the boost override influenced how emergency power systems were designed and implemented. Jet fighters incorporated official afterburner or reheat systems that provided temporary thrust increases with clearly defined procedures and limitations. These systems were engineered from the start to handle the stress of emergency power, rather than being improvised modifications of existing engines. But the spirit of the boost override, the willingness to push equipment beyond conservative limits when operationally necessary, remained part of military aviation culture. Test pilots exploring the edges of aircraft performance, combat pilots using every available resource to complete missions, and engineers designing systems with emergency capabilities all carried forward the principle that Kynoch had demonstrated. Sometimes the difference between success and failure is finding that last bit of performance that the designers left in reserve. The personal aftermath for those involved varied. Kynoch's post-war career at Rolls-Royce was successful, and he eventually became a senior engineer working on the Avon and Conway jet engines. He rarely spoke publicly about the boost override, considering it simply part of his wartime service. When interviewed by aviation historians in the 1970s, he emphasized the collaborative nature of the innovation, crediting pilots like Perry for being willing to test the modification and squadron commanders like Simmons for allowing the experimentation. Perry's post-war RAF career included a stint as a test pilot, where his experience with the boost override proved valuable. He understood intuitively how aircraft could be pushed beyond their nominal limits, and what signs to watch for that indicated approaching real limits. That knowledge made him a better test pilot, able to explore performance envelopes safely and systematically. Other participants in the boost override story had varied fates. Some remained in aviation, others returned to civilian life. A few didn't survive the war, killed in accidents or combat unrelated to the engine modification. Their contributions to the innovation are preserved in squadron records and the memories of those who served alongside them. The Mosquitos themselves, the aircraft that benefited from the boost override, had remarkable post-war careers. Many remained in service with the RAF and other air forces into the 1950s. Some were converted to civilian use, serving as fast transports or survey aircraft. A few survive today in museums, preserved examples of one of World War II's most successful aircraft designs. None of the surviving Mosquitos retained the boost override modification. Post-war, as the operational necessity disappeared, engines were returned to standard specifications. The modification existed only during the specific period when it was needed, a temporary adaptation to a temporary situation. But its impact on the aircraft's wartime effectiveness was permanent. The broader historical context helps explain why the boost override emerged when and where it did. By late 1943, the RAF had accumulated 4 years of combat experience, developing a deep understanding of what worked and what didn't. The service had learned to trust the judgment of experienced personnel at all levels, from squadron commanders to individual fitters. That trust created space for innovation. The timing was also significant. Earlier in the war, when Britain stood alone against Germany, there was less room for experimentation that might compromise aircraft reliability. Later in the war, with Allied victory increasingly certain, there was less pressure to squeeze every bit of performance from existing equipment. The boost override emerged at a moment when the operational need was acute, but the overall strategic situation was stable enough to allow calculated risks. The modification also benefited from the Mosquito's unique characteristics. As a wooden aircraft, it was lighter than metal contemporaries, which meant the additional power from boost override translated more directly into speed. The Mosquito's clean aerodynamic design meant it could take advantage of extra power without hitting drag limits. And its twin-engine configuration provided redundancy. If one engine failed due to boost override stress, the aircraft could still return home on the other. These factors combined to make the boost override particularly effective on the Mosquito. The same modification on other aircraft might not have produced comparable results. It was a solution tailored to a specific aircraft facing a specific threat, which is why it worked so well. The intelligence contribution of Mosquitos equipped with boost override deserves particular emphasis. The pre-invasion reconnaissance of Normandy beaches and coastal defenses conducted in early 1944 was critical to D-Day planning. Mosquitos photographed every meter of coastline, every German fortification, every obstacle on the beaches. Much of this reconnaissance was conducted by aircraft with boost override capability, allowing them to evade German fighters and complete their missions. The photographs these Mosquitos brought back informed decisions about where to land, what obstacles to expect, and how to neutralize German defenses. The intelligence was so detailed that Allied commanders could brief troops on specific pillboxes and gun emplacements they would encounter. This level of preparation contributed significantly to the invasion's success. Similar reconnaissance supported the strategic bombing campaign, helping target selectors identify the most valuable industrial facilities and assess bomb damage. Mosquitos photographed ball-bearing factories, oil refineries, aircraft plants, and rail yards, providing the intelligence needed to plan effective attacks. The boost override helped ensure these reconnaissance missions succeeded, even as German defenses improved. In the Far East, where Mosquitos arrived later in the war, the modification proved valuable against Japan. Though the Japanese Army and Navy Air Forces were in decline by 1944-45, they still posed threats to reconnaissance air. Mosquitos with boost override could outrun most Japanese fighters, completing missions over Burma, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies with acceptable loss rates. The final accounting of the boost override's impact must balance multiple factors. The performance gain was real but modest, 12 to 15 miles per hour, perhaps 10% improvement in maximum speed. The operational impact was significant but hard to isolate from other factors affecting mission success and loss rates. The maintenance cost was substantial but manageable within the RAF's logistics system. What's certain is that the people involved, pilots, fitters, and commanders, believed the modification made a crucial difference. They saw it work in combat, saw Mosquitos escape interceptions that might otherwise have. That operational experience, that frontline validation, mattered more than any theoretical analysis. The boost override represents a particular kind of innovation, not a breakthrough invention, but an incremental improvement that exploited existing capabilities more fully. It didn't require new technology or revolutionary insight, just a willingness to question conservative assumptions and accept calculated risks. This kind of innovation is often overlooked in favor of more dramatic development, but it's equally important to military effectiveness. In the end, the story of the boost override is about people solving problems with the resources available to them. Kynoch didn't have access to more powerful engines or advanced fuel, so he found a way to get more from what he had. Perry didn't have guns to fight back against German fighters, so he used speed as his weapon. Simmons didn't have authority to officially approve the modification, so he created space for it to develop informally. These were practical solutions to immediate problems, developed by experienced professionals who understood their equipment and their mission. The boost override worked because it was grounded in solid engineering knowledge, tested carefully before operational use, and implemented by people who knew what they were doing. The 12 miles per hour that Kynoch's modification unlocked might seem trivial in an era of supersonic jets and precision-guided weapons, but in 1943, over the skies of Germany, with a Messerschmitt closing from behind and nowhere to hide, those 12 miles per hour meant everything. They meant the difference between completing the mission and being shot down, between bringing home vital intelligence and becoming another lost statistic, between survival and death. That's why the boost override mattered. Not because it was revolutionary or dramatic, but because it was exactly what was needed, when it was needed, by the people who needed it most. In the complex calculus of air warfare, where margins are thin and stakes are high, even small advantages can determine outcomes. The RAF's Mosquito crews understood that, and so did Flight Sergeant James Kynoch when he adjusted that boost control gate in a maintenance hangar one December night in 1943. The Messerschmitts couldn't catch them anymore, and that made all the difference. If you found this story of wartime innovation fascinating, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more untold stories from aviation history. Hit that like button if you enjoyed learning how a simple field modification gave Mosquito crews the edge they needed to survive, and drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Did you know about the boost override before? What other lesser-known WSU innovations should we cover next? Your engagement helps us bring more of these incredible stories to light. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.